In the year 1734, within the ornate halls of Lisbon's royal palace, a child was born who would one day carry the weight of a kingdom upon her shoulders. Her name was Maria Francisca Isabel Josefa Antonia Gertrudes Rita Joanna of Braganza, though the world would come to know her simply as Queen Maria I of Portugal. From the very moment of her birth, Maria's life was bound by duty, faith, and the solemn expectations of monarchy. She was not raised as an ordinary child. Her toys were gilded, her clothes stitched with velvet and gold, but her heart was shaped less by luxury and more by devotion. She was taught that every thought, every word, and every action must reflect the will of God and the dignity of her royal blood. Her father, King Joseph I, looked upon her with pride, though in truth, the line of succession had always been fragile. Unlike in some courts of Europe, Portugal accepted the possibility of a queen regnant, and Maria, as the eldest surviving child, stood as heir to a legacy centuries old. The world outside her palace windows was turbulent and often uncertain. Yet within the court, Maria learned the lessons of silence, patience, and obedience, qualities that would mark her throughout her life. As a child, Maria was quiet. Courtiers described her as serious even in her earliest years, with large watchful eyes that missed nothing. While other children of noble birth played with dolls and ran about the gardens in restless joy, Maria was often found in chapels, gazing at flickering candles or whispering her own small prayers. Her governesses noted her intelligence. She absorbed lessons in history, scripture, and philosophy with an eagerness unusual for a young girl. Languages came to her naturally: Latin for the church, French for diplomacy, Portuguese for the heart of her people. Yet above all, it was religion that drew her attention. Her faith was not mere ritual. It was deep, personal, and consuming. This piety made her loved by priests, admired by her tutors, and respected by her family. But it also gave her a grave air, as though she bore the weight of destiny long before she was old enough to understand it. There were moments of gentleness, however. Maria was known to smile at music, her hands folded as singers filled the palace with hymns. She found comfort in the rhythm of chants, in the steady repetition of psalms. To her, these were not just sounds, but echoes of eternity. The courtiers whispered that the little princess had a soul older than her years. Royal children were never left to grow wild. Every hour of Maria's day was structured. She awoke early to the tolling of bells, prayed before breakfast, studied under the watchful eye of her tutors, and spent evenings in lessons of music and comportment. She was trained in the art of dignity, how to walk, how to sit, how to bow her head with just the right measure of humility and pride. Her hands were taught to move gracefully, her words to fall with precision. Even her silences were shaped, for in silence a princess could command as much respect as in speech. Her religious instruction was intense. Confessors and theologians visited regularly, feeding her mind with scripture and moral debates. She grew to believe that her role as heir was not simply political but spiritual, that God had chosen her as shepherd to a nation. This belief would later sustain her and break her. From childhood, Maria learned that the crown was a cross, and she accepted it with quiet determination. As Maria grew into a young woman, the question of marriage pressed upon her. In royal courts, marriage was rarely about love. It was about bloodlines, alliances, and duty. For Maria, the path chosen was both familiar and unsettling. She was to marry her uncle, Infante Pedro of Portugal. To modernize, such a match may seem unnatural, but in the dynastic politics of the 18th century, it was not unusual. The union would preserve the royal bloodline and secure the throne for her descendants. Maria, devout as ever, accepted this destiny with little protest. She saw in Pedro not only her uncle, but a man of stability and gentleness. Their marriage, though arranged, was free from scandal. It was a partnership of mutual respect, marked by children who would carry forward the Braganza line. In Pedro, Maria found something rare for a royal marriage: support. He allowed her piety to guide her life and shared her devotion to family. For a time, her world felt steady, and the future, though heavy with responsibility, seemed secure. But always the shadow of the throne loomed. Her father, King Joseph I, grew older, his health declining. The ministers whispered, the nobles speculated, and Maria, though surrounded by children and husband, knew that her fate was drawing closer. She prayed nightly for strength. She prayed for wisdom. She prayed that God would guide her hand when the day came that she would wear the crown. And yet, even in her prayers, there was fear. For Maria knew her own nature: sensitive, devout, prone to melancholy. To rule a kingdom was no simple matter. To be both mother and sovereign, both pious and pragmatic, was a burden greater than any chapel prayer could prepare her for. Still, she bowed her head, whispering words of surrender to the divine. Fiat voluntas tua, thy will be done. Thus ended the first chapter of Maria's life, the life of a dutiful princess. She had been molded by faith, shaped by duty, and surrounded by the expectations of royalty. She was not yet queen, but the weight of the crown already pressed upon her shoulders. Soon, the prayers of her youth would meet the reality of power. Soon, the pious princess would become the pious queen, and the story of her reign, glorious, tragic, and unforgettable, would begin. In the year 1777, the bells of Lisbon tolled not in celebration, but in solemnity. King Joseph I of Portugal had passed away, and with his death, the crown was passed to his eldest daughter. The court held its breath as Maria, at 43 years of age, prepared to become the first woman to rule Portugal in her own right. No longer merely Princess Maria, no longer only the dutiful daughter, the careful wife, the devout mother. Now, she was to be Queen Maria I, sovereign of a kingdom with centuries of history upon its shoulders. The coronation was a grand affair, filled with velvet, jewels, incense, and candlelight. Priests sang hymns that echoed through vaulted ceilings, nobles knelt in shimmering robes, and Maria herself, dressed in resplendent coronation garments, looked every inch the ruler her people long awaited. Yet behind her solemn eyes lay not pride, but prayer. She whispered to herself as the crown was lifted above her head, God grant me wisdom, God grant me strength, God grant me mercy. The crown was heavy, both in weight and in meaning, and Maria knew, even as it touched her brow, that her reign would be unlike any Portugal had seen before. From the very beginning, Maria earned the admiration of her people. She was not a queen who thirsted for conquest, nor a ruler who flaunted wealth for her own vanity. Instead, she was guided by conscience, by the unshakable compass of her Catholic faith. One of her first acts was mercy. Those who had suffered imprisonment under the iron grip of her father's minister, the Marquis of Pombal, were released. Political prisoners, long silenced in dark cells, stepped once again into the light. It was said that Maria wept as she read their petitions, her tears falling upon the parchment as if they were blessings from heaven itself. The court was startled. Here was a monarch who would not rule with cold efficiency or ruthless politics, but with the tenderness of a mother. To her people, she was not merely a sovereign. She was a figure of piety and compassion, so much so that she was given a name, Maria the Pious. Her reign, at least in its early years, reflected that devotion. Churches flourished, sermons inspired the faithful, and Lisbon itself seemed wrapped in an air of moral renewal. Yet beneath the hymns and the reverence, the demands of rule still pressed heavily. For the business of a kingdom was not only prayer, it was taxation, diplomacy, and the endless burdens of governance. Day after day, Maria's court reflected her character. Mass was celebrated not once but often twice in the royal chapel. She listened attentively to priests, asked questions of theologians, and even took part in lengthy discussions about scripture. Her ministers sometimes grew weary. They wished their queen would focus more on alliances, on commerce, on military strength. But Maria's heart was set on holiness. She believed Portugal's strength did not lie merely in ships or soldiers, but in the purity of its faith. Each decision she made was measured not against political advantage but against her conscience. Could she stand before God and defend it? If yes, she would act. If no, she would resist. This gave her reign a unique character. It was less about glory and more about righteousness, less about ambition and more about duty. And yet, even as the court admired her piety, whispers began. Could such devotion sustain a kingdom in a Europe increasingly swept by revolution and change? Could a queen who prayed so fervently also rule with the decisiveness demanded of a sovereign? Still, in those early years, her reign glowed with serenity. She believed she was chosen by heaven. She believed her prayers would shield her from despair. She believed, above all, that God was near. While she carried the crown of a queen, Maria also carried the mantle of motherhood. Her children were her joy, her comfort, and her strength. Her eldest son, Jose, was groomed as heir to the throne. He was bright, charming, and beloved by the court. In him, Maria saw the continuation of the dynasty, a living answer to her prayers that Portugal's future was secure. Her younger children also brought her solace, filling the halls of the palace with laughter. To Maria, motherhood was not a distraction from monarchy but an extension of it. Just as she ruled her nation with faith and tenderness, so too did she nurture her family. Even courtiers remarked that the queen seemed most at peace when surrounded by her children. In those moments, the heavy lines of duty softened, and the stern piety in her eyes gave way to gentleness. But destiny, ever cruel, waits in silence. And while these were golden years for Maria, shadows lingered just beyond the horizon. For now, her reign was marked by devotion, her people comforted by her compassion, her children filling her days with hope. Yet Maria's spirit was fragile. Her devotion, though admired, bordered on severity. She confessed endlessly, feared sin deeply, and often wept in private over the weight of her soul. Even as her subjects praised her as Maria the Pious, some wondered if her mind carried too much sorrow, Too much fear, too much weight. But for the moment the queen endured. Her prayers still gave her strength. Her faith still anchored her heart. And the world still looked upon her as a ruler blessed with the touch of heaven. It would not last. Thus the world knew her as Maria the Pious, a queen of mercy, a ruler of faith, a woman whose crown was less ornament than burden. But history rarely leaves such stories untouched. Behind the hymns of her reign, behind the prayers whispered in candlelight, a storm was gathering, one that faith alone could not banish. Soon tragedy would strike. Soon the queen's piety would turn to anguish, and Maria, once the beacon of holiness, would become the prisoner of her own despair. To rule a kingdom was never an easy task. To rule as a woman in the 18th century was harder still. For though Maria was sovereign in name, she was surrounded by men, ministers, advisors, generals, nobles, all of whom whispered counsel into her ear, each with their own vision of Portugal's destiny. Some wanted war, some wanted peace, some demanded reforms, others clung to tradition. And in the midst of this cacophony sat Maria, whose heart longed for simplicity, for prayer, for quiet devotion. But queens cannot live in silence. Queens must choose, and each choice carried the weight not only of politics, but of her own trembling conscience. She tried to rule as she prayed, with fairness, humility, and fear of God. Yet the business of the state was seldom so merciful. Diplomacy required cunning, trade required ruthlessness, and the defense of a nation required blood. Each night, after the council had dispersed, Maria returned to her chapel, her forehead pressed against the cold wood of the altar. She whispered the same words again and again. God, do not let me fail. God, do not let me falter. But even then, the weight of the crown pressed heavily, and the queen began to bend beneath its burden. The late 18th century was no time of peace for Europe. Across the continent, kingdoms quaked beneath the tremors of change. Revolutions stirred, monarchies fell, and new ideas of liberty and reason spread like wildfire. Maria watched with alarm as France, once a beacon of monarchy, descended into turmoil. Heads rolled from guillotines, kings and queens were dethroned, and the very notion of divine rule was mocked. Portugal, though distant, could not remain untouched. Ministers warned her of uprisings, of dangerous whispers among students and merchants, of the growing strength of ideas carried not by armies, but by pamphlets and speeches. Maria's heart, already fragile, trembled at the thought. She prayed more fervently, hoping that faith would shield Portugal from the chaos that consumed Europe. Yet deep within her, a fear began to grow, that God's judgment was near, not only upon her soul, but upon her kingdom. Through the growing storm of politics, one thing sustained Maria: her family. Her husband, Infante Pedro, remained a steady presence, and her children brought her comfort. In particular, her eldest son José, Prince of Brazil, was her pride. Groomed as heir, he was handsome, capable, and full of promise. Courtiers remarked that José might one day bring Portugal into a golden age, blending his mother's faith with the decisiveness she sometimes lacked. Maria clung to him. In José, she saw not only the future of her dynasty, but the hope of her nation. Each time her mind grew weary with politics, each time her heart trembled with fear of revolution, She turned to her son and found strength. Her family was her refuge, her anchor against the storms of Europe. So long as they remained by her side, she believed she could endure anything. But fate, silent and merciless, was waiting just beyond the horizon. Even in these years of relative peace, whispers began to circulate in the court. Servants spoke of the queen's tears, of her restless nights, of her tendency to withdraw for hours in prayer. Her devotion, once praised as strength, began to appear as fragility. Ministers exchanged glances when her voice trembled in council. Courtiers whispered when she avoided decisions, leaving matters unresolved. To the people, she was still Maria the Pious. But within the palace, some began to wonder if piety was slowly transforming into weakness. Her confessors noticed too. Her confessions grew longer, filled with fear, guilt, and despair. She spoke of sins uncommitted, of punishments unearned, of a darkness that pressed upon her soul. It was not yet madness, but it was sorrow deep and consuming, and those who looked closely saw that their queen was beginning to crack. Still, Maria pressed on. She fulfilled her duties, attended councils, ruled her court with dignity. Outwardly, she was the same queen who had earned the love of her people. But the foreboding would not leave her. She began to sense, in every flicker of candlelight, in every toll of the church bells, that tragedy was drawing near. At night, she sometimes spoke aloud in her chambers, begging God to spare her children, to spare her kingdom, to spare her soul. Servants reported hearing her voice trembling through the doors, echoing like a prayer and a lament all at once. She knew not what was coming, but her heart felt the shadow, and soon it would fall upon her in ways that no prayer, no crown, no kingdom could withstand. Thus ended the years of trial, the years when Maria balanced her devotion with the duties of rule, when her faith still shielded her from despair. But history is relentless. The burdens of a crown, the tremors of Europe, and the cruel hand of fate were preparing to strike. And when they did, the pious queen would break. The trials of governance would give way to something deeper, something darker. The shadow of grief, the shattering of the mind. The world would no longer call her Maria the Pious. They would call her Maria the Mad. Tragedy does not arrive all at once. It comes first as a whisper, then a shadow, then a storm that cannot be stopped. For Maria, the storm began with the death of her beloved husband, Infante Pedro. Pedro had been more than a consort. He had been her anchor, her steady hand, the quiet presence who shared her faith and her burdens. Their marriage, though born of duty, had grown into something rare in royal courts: respect, gentleness, and trust. When he fell ill, Maria prayed with desperation. She paced the palace halls at night, hands clasped, eyes red with tears. She pleaded before God to spare him. She vowed fasting. She whispered promises of sacrifice. But no prayer could alter the will of fate. Pedro died, and with his death, something in Maria's soul fractured. The court mourned, the bells tolled, black drapery hung across the palace. But it was Maria's grief that shook Portugal most of all. Her sobs echoed through the corridors, heard by servants and courtiers alike. She cried not as a queen, but as a widow, a woman undone. If the loss of her husband shattered her heart, the loss of her son crushed her entirely. José, Prince of Brazil, her eldest child, her heir, her hope for Portugal's future, fell ill soon after. He was young, full of promise, beloved by the people. To Maria, he was not only her son but the light of her reign, the certainty that her dynasty and her kingdom would endure. Again she prayed. Again she begged. Again she cried before altars until her knees ached against the stone floors. She clung to hope as mothers do, believing her son would rise again, that God would spare at least this most precious gift. But Jose too was taken. The palace fell silent. The court wept. And Maria collapsed into despair. Witnesses said her cries could be heard across the palace gardens, wild and unrestrained. She tore at her hair, wailed aloud, and sank into a grief that no words could soothe. It was then that whispers began. Whispers of a queen undone not only by sorrow, but by madness. After these losses, Maria was no longer the same queen. Her prayers grew frantic, not serene. She muttered endlessly, sometimes repeating the same psalm dozens of times in a single sitting. Ministers waiting in council reported her sudden bursts of tears, her trembling voice, her inability to focus on matters of state. At night, the palace grew restless with her cries. She wailed loudly in her chambers, sometimes hysterical, sometimes incoherent. Servants whispered of strange sights. The queen speaking to shadows, conversing with the dead, or calling out to her lost husband and son as if they still lingered beside her. One chilling account told of Maria walking the palace gardens at night, stopping before a tree and speaking to it as though it were alive, as though the soul of her departed child had taken root in its branches. The ministers, once patient, grew alarmed. The court, once reverent, grew fearful. Portugal's queen was slipping into darkness, and there was no one strong enough to pull her back. In public ceremonies, the queen's instability became undeniable. There were days she could not appear at all, locked in her chambers, too distraught to stand before her people. On other occasions, she appeared pale, trembling, her eyes distant, her speech incoherent. Sometimes she laughed suddenly, a high and unsettling sound. Sometimes she screamed without cause. Foreign ambassadors wrote reports of the mad Queen of Portugal, spreading rumors across Europe of her decline. Courtiers who once praised her as Maria the Pious now lowered their voices, calling her Maria the Mad. It was not cruelty, but fear. For how could a kingdom stand when its sovereign could not hold her own mind? And yet, beneath all this there was tragedy. For Maria was not a tyrant, nor a cruel ruler. She was simply a woman, broken by grief, burdened by duty, and crushed by a sorrow too great for any heart to endure. What made Maria's madness most haunting was that it grew from the very faith that had once sustained her. Her devotion, once gentle, became obsessive. She confessed endlessly, convinced that her losses were punishment from God. She believed she was condemned, that she had sinned too greatly to be forgiven, that the deaths of her husband and son were divine judgment. She lashed herself with guilt. She spoke of hell. She trembled at visions unseen by others. And her prayers, instead of bringing comfort, seemed only to deepen her torment. To be Maria the Pious was once her glory, but now her piety consumed her, feeding the fires of her madness. By the final years of the 18th century, Maria's condition could no longer be hidden. The kingdom was effectively ruled not by the queen, but by her ministers and increasingly, by her surviving son, Prince João. The court made quiet arrangements. Decisions were signed in her name, though her hand barely touched the parchment. The machinery of the state turned, but the queen herself was absent, lost in a prison of her own mind. Yet even in her madness, Portugal could not abandon her. For she was still their queen, still the anointed sovereign, still Maria I of Portugal. And so she remained in the palace, her days divided between spells of clarity and storms of despair, until history itself forced her into exile. But that belongs to another chapter. For now, in these years of grief and madness, Maria was a queen in name only. A woman trapped between faith and despair, between memory and delusion, between the throne she once carried with dignity and the sorrow that had torn her soul apart. Thus, Maria the pious became Maria the mad. Not by choice, not by corruption, but by grief too great for any heart to bear. History is often cruel in its names. It remembers her madness, but forgets her mercy. It remembers her screams, but forgets her prayers. It remembers the broken queen, but not the loving mother. And yet, this too is part of her story, the descent from light into darkness, the unraveling of a queen who once sought only to serve God and her people. The next chapter will take her beyond the palace, across the seas, into exile. But the sorrow, the madness, the grief, these would never leave her. By the turn of the century, the royal palace in Lisbon had become not a seat of power, but a place of whispers and shadows. Its grand corridors, once filled with ceremony and song, grew heavy with silence. Doors were shut, curtains were drawn, and behind those veils of secrecy lived a queen no longer seen by her people. Maria I, once radiant, once strong, now rarely stepped outside her chambers. The palace became her prison, not by chains of iron, but by the chains of her own mind. Attendants spoke softly around her, moving carefully, never knowing when her moods might shift. At times, she sat quietly, muttering prayers, her rosary moving through trembling fingers. At other times, she erupted suddenly, shrieking, sobbing, or calling out names of the dead. The palace lived at the rhythm of her despair. Madness does not move in straight lines. It comes and goes like the sea, rising suddenly in storms, falling again into uneasy calm. For Maria, some days brought a fragile peace. She could sit in her chamber, gaze out the window toward the Tagus River, and speak with clarity, even tenderness. Courtiers sometimes hoped that she was recovering, that their queen might return to them. But the calm never lasted. Without warning, she would burst into screams, her voice echoing through the palace halls. She cried that demons were upon her. She spoke of eternal damnation, of fires that consumed her soul. She shouted at attendants, mistaking them for shadows of the dead. On some nights, her cries carried into the city itself, chilling those who lived near the palace walls. Lisbon knew their queen not by sight, but by the haunting sound of her despair. While the queen lived in torment, the kingdom still demanded governance. Portugal could not wait for her recovery. Laws needed to be signed. Wars needed decisions. Trade required oversight. Thus, her ministers, once mere advisors, became the rulers in practice. They met quietly, sometimes in chambers away from the queen's rooms, where her cries could not disturb them. They made decisions in her name, affixing the royal seal without her true awareness. Her surviving son, Prince João, carried the heaviest burden. At first, he hesitated, still hoping his mother might regain her strength. But as the years passed, it became clear the queen would never again rule. And so João stepped forward, reluctant but resolute, becoming the effective leader of Portugal long before he was crowned king. Though Maria was hidden away, her people did not forget her. In the streets of Lisbon, she was still called Maria the Pious. They remembered her generosity, her charity, her devotion to God. For many, her madness was not seen as cruelty or weakness, but as tragedy. She was a queen broken by sorrow, not corrupted by power. Pilgrims lit candles in her name. Churches prayed for her healing. And when stories spread of her cries, of her visions, of her wandering mind, the people whispered not only of fear but also of pity. To them, she was a suffering soul, one of their own, caught in the grip of grief too great to bear. Maria's days followed strange and sorrowful rhythms. She rose before dawn, often after sleepless nights filled with cries and visions. She demanded endless prayers, sometimes ordering chaplains to repeat Mass again and again, as though repetition might undo her sins. Meals were brought, but she often refused them, believing herself unworthy to eat. At times she fasted obsessively, punishing her body for imagined transgressions. At other times, she ate with sudden urgency, as if fearing the food would vanish before her eyes. Her chamber was filled with religious icons, crosses, candles, paintings of saints. Yet instead of comfort, they often deepened her torment, reminders of the God she felt had forsaken her. Beyond the palace walls, the world did not pause. Europe was shifting. Revolutions stirred across the continent. Napoleon rose in France. Empires clashed and kingdoms trembled. Yet within Lisbon, their queen remained absent, her voice silenced by grief and madness. Foreign envoys noted her decline with curiosity, even mockery. They wrote of Portugal as a kingdom ruled by ministers and a prince, for its queen was no longer truly present. Still she held the title. Still she wore the crown and name. And still, within the palace, the fiction of her reign continued, even as reality drifted farther away. As years turned to decades, Maria's world grew smaller and darker. The palace gardens, once her solace, became too frightening. She no longer walked among the trees she once spoke to. Instead, she remained confined to her rooms, where shadows lengthened and time lost its meaning. Visitors saw only glimpses of her, a frail woman, hair disheveled, eyes haunted. She spoke in fragments, half prayers, half visions. She mistook the living for the dead, and the present for the past. The once vibrant Queen of Portugal was now a figure of legend, a ghost within her own court. Thus ended Maria's reign in Lisbon, not with abdication, not with rebellion, but with silence. Her son ruled in her stead. Her ministers carried the weight of the crown, and the queen herself faded, year by year, into the shadows of her own grief. Yet Portugal still called her queen, and in that title, despite her suffering, there remained dignity. For though her mind had betrayed her, her people never truly did. As the 19th century dawned, Europe shook under the weight of Napoleon Bonaparte. One by one, kingdoms fell or bent before him. His armies marched across borders with fire and steel, leaving fear in their wake. Portugal, small but proud, could not escape his gaze. The French demanded obedience, demanded allegiance to their wars, demanded that Portugal turn against Britain, its oldest ally. But Portugal's court, fractured and fragile, hesitated. And in that hesitation, Napoleon saw weakness. The French armies moved toward Lisbon. The people trembled. And within the palace, Maria, already lost to madness, was shielded from the full truth. She would not have understood, or perhaps she would have screamed louder than ever before. The decision was made. The royal family must flee. In November of 1807, under cover of urgency and fear, the Portuguese royal court abandoned their homeland. Ships waited in the Tagus River, sails ready, decks crowded with noblemen, servants, and treasures hastily gathered from the palace. The queen was carried aboard, confused, frail, unaware of the magnitude of what was happening. She asked where they were going, why the palace was being left behind. Attendants answered gently, soothing her with half-truths, as if calming a restless child. The fleet departed. Behind them, Lisbon faded into the horizon. Ahead lay a voyage across the Atlantic, a journey to Brazil, the jewel of Portugal's empire, and now its last refuge. For weeks, the ships rocked on endless seas. The courtiers endured storms, hunger, and sickness. And through it all, Maria drifted in and out of delirium, her cries echoing even across the decks at night. In January of 1808, the royal fleet reached Rio de Janeiro. The city, vibrant and alive, had never seen such a spectacle. Ships heavy with nobles, ministers, and treasures of a kingdom uprooted. Streets filled with crowds eager to see their monarchs, to welcome the distant court of Portugal. Yet among the cheering, one figure remained silent. Maria I, Queen of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, was carried ashore in silence, her eyes vacant, her mind adrift. For the people of Brazil, she was a figure of reverence, a sovereign whose presence symbolized Portugal's faith in its colony. But in truth, she was already gone, her body present but her spirit trapped in shadows of madness. In Brazil, the court established itself anew. Palaces were built, councils were held, and for the first time, Rio became the beating heart of a European kingdom. Ministers worked tirelessly to govern from afar. Prince João, long the regent, became the true center of power. He signed decrees, established trade, and ruled in his mother's name. But Maria remained hidden. She seldom appeared in public, and when she did, it was only for the briefest of moments. Frail, pale, carried more than walking. The Brazilians respected her, prayed for her, but their queen was a shadow. It was João they saw as ruler, João who built the bridge between Europe and the New World. In the final years of her life, Maria withdrew almost completely. She remained within her chambers, surrounded by attendants, her days marked by ritual and silence. She prayed, sometimes with clarity, sometimes with cries of despair. She spoke of death often, as though it lingered close. Her son visited, though their conversations were one-sided. He spoke gently, telling her of the kingdom, of victories and challenges. She listened sometimes, smiled faintly, but more often stared past him, lost in visions unseen. Her body weakened as her mind unraveled. The queen who had once walked proudly through Lisbon's grand halls now struggled even to rise from her chair. And yet, within her brokenness, there remained a strange dignity. For she was still Maria I, still a queen, still a mother, still a woman who had once carried the burdens of empire and faith. On March 20th, 1816, Queen Maria I of Portugal passed away in Rio de Janeiro. She was 81 years old. Her reign had lasted nearly 4 decades, though much of it was marked by grief and madness. Her death was mourned across 2 continents: Portugal, the land she had left behind, and Brazil, the land that had sheltered her in exile. Bells tolled in Lisbon and Rio alike. Churches filled with prayers. The queen who had entered history as Maria the Pious and departed it as Maria the Mad was finally at rest. History gave her a cruel name, Maria the Mad. It remembered her screams, her visions, her endless grief. But those who look deeper see something else. They see a queen who loved fiercely, who prayed with sincerity, who cared for her people and her faith. They see a woman undone not by cruelty or tyranny, but by sorrow, the loss of a husband, the loss of a son, the unbearable weight of grief. Her reign ended not with betrayal, not with rebellion, but with silence. And in that silence, Portugal endured. Maria I was the first queen regnant of Portugal. She ruled in her own right. She left her mark upon a kingdom and upon history. And though she is remembered for her madness, she should also be remembered for her humanity. For in the story of Maria the Mad, we do not see only a queen. We see the fragile line between power and vulnerability, between crown and soul, between the ruler and the broken heart beneath.